innovation is more than just technology. It's innovation of new healthcare delivery systems. How do we deal with rural health? How do we deal with home health? How do we deal with an aging population? FDA needs to play a leadership role in advancing those improvements.
Hello, I'm Wayne Pines, and welcome to this bonus episode number 4 of FDA Watch.
And I'm Shelly Garg, and thanks for joining us today as we continue our coverage of what's happening at FDA during these rather unpredictable times.
The terrific response we've received from literally hundreds of subscribers to these bonus episodes has only strengthened our mission to keep you current on FDA developments. If you missed any of our previous bonus episodes or any of our previous episodes, you might want to check them out. Go to fdawatch.net. I'll repeat that, fdawatch.net. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. It's free, and it guarantees you won't miss a single episode. Today we have 2 terrific guests, very knowledgeable. I've known them both for a long time. They're here to discuss the recent news, the cutbacks, the new personnel at FDA, and most importantly, the impact of what's really happening at FDA right now. So let's meet them right now.
Thanks, Wayne. First up is Ron Bartek. Ron is co-founder and president of Friedreich's Ataxia Research Alliance, the former director and chair of the National Organization for Rare Disorders, past president and current member of the board of directors at the Alliance for a Stronger FDA. Welcome to FDA Watch, Ron.
Thank you very much, Shelly.
And also joining us is Ralph Hall. Ralph leads Hall Strategies. It's a consulting firm. He's been with a number of other firms, Levitt Partners. He taught for a long time at the University of Minnesota Law School, is renowned as one of the most distinguished food and drug law professors in the country. He's testified before congressional committees. He's authored about 40 articles. And I have to note that Ralph and I are co-editing the 8th edition of a book called The Practical Guide to Food and Drug Law and Regulation on behalf of the Food and Drug Law Institute. And that book should be available, hopefully, by the end of the year. So welcome to FDA Watch, Ralph.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Let me start with Ron with some questions. Ron, you've been monitoring what's been going on at FDA. You've been involved on behalf of the Friedreich Ataxia group for so many times. That's a group that you founded and still continue to be the major player in. I just want to start with a general question and ask the same question to Ralph. What's your reaction? What's your take on what's going on right now, and how will it affect patients, and how will it affect industry?
Well, that's a terrific question, Wayne. And as you can imagine, it's been heavy on my brain and heavy on my heart since this all got underway. And I'd say my impression thus far is one of great concern, because I've been working with very closely with dear colleagues and at the FDA for about 25 years, and I'm just marveling at the tremendous progress that the agency has made in the space in which I'm most involved, that of rare diseases, and all the leadership that they've exerted. I mean, it's not like we've been trying to drag them along with us to do patient-focused drug development. You would remember as well as I how the agency actually created that program, helped form that program well before the Congress legislated it. I can remember in February of 2012, about 10 months before the legislation, Janet Woodcock leading the first patient-focused drug development meeting in the Great Hall at the FDA, and saying out loud to all of us, I'd love to be able to tell you that it's all about the data. All we do here in reviewing an application is add up all the data points and we come up with our answer, but I'd be lying through my teeth if I were to say so. At the end of the day, it's a human judgment. That's where we need patient voices to help make that human judgment. And that carried on through Janet and Teresa Mullen's work. And we've got this fantastic patient-focused drug development undertaking that's changed the nature of the agency and its relationship with our patient population. So I'm concerned about that progress being able to continue.
Ralph, your take on what's going on.
Let me give a couple of thoughts. Obviously, there's tremendous angst right now, both within FDA and outside of FDA. What is going to happen? What are the next steps? I am concerned that there is going to be paralysis, both within FDA and also in the regulated community and in the patient community, as people try to sort this out. And I think we need to avoid paralysis. We have to continue to move forward. I also want to make clear that we are only partway through this process. There are many more changes still to come, and those will impact how all of this plays out. And finally, we have to understand that there are very good people at FDA, and right now there's naturally challenges with morale, with the culture. What are the next steps? And so for people dealing with FDA, it's understanding those morale challenges, I think, is very important.
Thanks, Ralph. Can you comment on what parts of the FDA, CDER, CDRH, CBER, Human Foods Program, do you think are under the most pressure or going through the most change? And are there specific therapeutic areas or product categories that are feeling the biggest impact? Ron, we'll start with you first.
Okay, excellent question, Shelly. And I'd have to answer it in two parts. The first is that thus far, both in CDER and in CBER, we have not felt in our disease group, Friedreich's ataxia, tremendous impact already. I'd say that because we've had CBER meetings and CDER meetings that proceeded apace and on schedule, on time. Okay. But we're deeply concerned about the future of all that, because if you look at things like user fees that are coming under severe challenge, and you look at the kinds of flexibilities that the FDA has been willing to manifest in terms of accelerated approval, in terms of accepting applications based on a single adequate and well-controlled study with confirmatory evidence. These are flexibilities that took decades to develop. Yeah. And so we're concerned that with a change in leadership, that if it goes back to what Ralph said earlier about making conservative judgments versus flexible scientific judgments, if those reviewers don't have the kind of leadership that says we've got your backs, we know there'll be risks and uncertainties, but that we need to embrace, then the default position is almost always no. And that would slow down the kind of progress we need to continue making in all these developments, drugs, biologics, and devices.
Thanks, Ron. Ralph, any comments?
A couple of thoughts. I think you ask about specific areas that are getting greater attention. I think if you're in the foods area, there's greater attention, obviously vaccines, antidepressants, particularly in pediatric populations. I think those are examples of areas that are getting additional attention. I think it's simplistic to say this administration is pro-regulation or anti-regulation. I think it's more nuanced than that. I agree with Ron. What at least I'm seeing is an effort to keep the trains on time with reviews, with preset meetings, et cetera. I see concerns beyond the review staff in the groups that do policy development, guidance development, groups that are responsible for communications, support groups. So the reviewers don't work in a vacuum. They work as part of a broader system. And some of the other parts of the system have had great change. As a specific example, in the generic drug area, there are many product-specific guidances. Well, the group, as I understand it, that work on those is basically gone. So the reviewers can do today's submissions, but I think there's an open question what happens down the line.
Ron, we've both been involved for a long time with the orphan drug community, and FDA has done, I think, a very good job. Again, go back to Janet Woodcock. She was very aggressive in being flexible about the criteria for orphan drugs. Talk a little bit about what impact you are seeing in terms of orphan drugs. Orphan drugs have been carved out a little bit in CEDAR and in CBER, but moving forward, what do you anticipate?
Wow, that's another terrific question, Wayne. And you know as well or better than I how much progress the agency has made on behalf of rare disease patients all over the country, and all kinds of manifestations of that progress. One is that of the approvals done over the last couple of years, more than half of those approved, slightly more than half of those approvals have been of orphan products. And that's a real testimony to the agency and the kinds of flexibilities that they've had in their guidance packages for some time, but now are finding the sweet spots. Take our disease group, for example. We were able to get our first approval of a treatment on Rare Disease Day of 2023 in Friedreich's ataxia, largely because of the flexibility the agency has manifest in their guidance packages about using an application of a single adequate and well-controlled study with confirmatory evidence. The confirmatory evidence in our case was twofold. One was basic science data that showed mechanism of action equals mechanism of damage. And also, most importantly, the use of a natural history database as an external control that provided the scientific insight that this drug was slowing progression by about 55% over the 3 years period. So, make a long story short, the agency has been especially attentive to our needs in the rare disease community, and we just need to keep that momentum going.
Yeah, Ron, if you would elaborate on the issues involving orphan drugs, especially the concept of flexibility in clinical trials.
I love the question. And I would add two things. First of all, I would add that the agency has been very responsive in all kinds of ways to our concerns about orphan products. A very recent response was to develop for the first time the Rare Disease Innovation Hub that is designed to, and it's already produced its first strategic plan, designed to collaborate and coordinate across all the centers and all the offices in regards to orphan products. And I think that's a wonderful addition to an already robust commitment on the part of the agency to address orphan products. The other thing is back to the matter of flexibility. Ralph and I were both involved, along with our dear friend and colleague, Amy Rick, last year in developing what was called the July 16th Roundtable discussion of pediatric inclusion. And this was something that was just powerful. We had all three medical center product directors, Patrizia Cavazzoni, Peter Marks, and Michelle Tarver, lead the opening fireside chat panel discussion in which they all said compellingly that we have pivoted from trying to protect children from clinical trials to trying to protect them with clinical trials so that we can give them safe, effective treatment at the best time for them. And we've actually formed an alliance to try to drive that message, try to socialize that message. So among all the stakeholders, and there were 350 such stakeholders in that roundtable discussion. So just tremendous progress being made by the agency and with the agency in all these matters of the additional flexibility, especially orphan products need going forward for our patients. But that pediatric inclusion applied to all diseases. So thank you for the question.
In summary, historically, courts have looked at substantive decisions, jurisdictional decisions, and process. And they've given FDA great discretion on the substance. And they've done their role with jurisdiction and with process. Now I think what we're seeing is an increasing potential for courts to inject themselves into the substantive decisions. And that's one of the major issues in the reproductive rights cases.
Yeah, Ralph, I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you to put on your professor hat. What are the key legal issues that FDA needs to deal with? We will have a new general counsel. There is a new overseer general counsel, so to speak, at HHS. But what are the key legal issues that FDA is going to face?
As you pointed out, there's a somewhat new structure for legal oversight of FDA with a new deputy general counsel at the HHS level, to whom the chief counsel at FDA will report. We currently, as of this time, don't have a permanent chief counsel. I think the issues fall into some buckets, some of which impact FDA but kind of outside their control. Things like employment questions. How can you lay people off? Contract questions. How can contracts be discontinued? So you have all of those questions that are being argued in a variety of contexts. But in the administrative law area with FDA, there are open issues on jurisdiction, the recent LDT decision, for example. There's decisions coming out on FDA's flexibility in deciding what constitutes things such as valid scientific evidence. And, I have to mention a couple of cases. I can't, it's genetic. A very recent Supreme Court case, Wages and White and Lion, happens to be in the tobacco area, but talks about the flexibility of FDA in determining what constitutes valid scientific evidence. And also the role of states here is, I think, evolving, including a case out of the Fifth Circuit in the last week addressing those kinds of issues. So I would be watching the administrative law area, the jurisdictional areas primarily. In the administrative law, we're still working through Loper-Bright. We're working through what is the major questions doctrine. We're in a period that is a massive change in administrative law. It's not just at FDA, it's much broader, but it clearly impacts FDA.
Loper-Bright until now has been used, and I'm going to ask you to explain it, if you would, very briefly for those who are not familiar with the case. But there's concerns that might be used in the reproductive rights area. Can you put that into context, because it already has been used even pre the last election, and I think that's something that when it happens will be front page news.
Right. So basically, what Loper-Bright discusses is what discretion, if any, a court should give to how an administrative agency, FDA in our case, interprets its statute. Do you give discretion to FDA and you uphold them as long as it's reasonable, or does the court look at it basically with a blank slate? An earlier case, Chevron, said give discretion. Loper-Bright reverses that and says standalone review by the agency. So that involves then, to your question about the reproductive rights, if somebody wants to challenge an approval, which is what's happening in some of those cases, how much flexibility or discretion do you give to FDA for their interpretation of the statutory requirements? And the plaintiffs in those cases are saying give very little, and the other side is saying that's FDA's scientific job. So this also raises the question, what's a scientific question that should be left to the discretion of FDA? What is a legal question that the court should decide? And we're going to hear from the Texas court in the near future. And I just mentioned this Wages and White and Lion case. That also addresses FDA's review of data and upheld FDA in rejecting hundreds of new tobacco product applications. So we need to look at those cases and how they evolve.
Thanks, Ralph. A question for you. What signals should stakeholders be paying attention to when trying to anticipate FDA priorities? Obviously, this is, a very unpredictable time. And so if you could just comment on what companies, patients, or healthcare providers could or should be doing to stay ahead of these changes and really, listening to certain signals and trying to anticipate as best as possible.
I'm trying to track and watch a couple of things in no particular order. What's happening with staffing? Not just the formal reductions in force, but there's a lot of talk about people leaving the agency for jobs in the private sector. How is that going to happen? How big will that be? Another thing I'm trying to watch is the role of FDA in their external engagements. It may be advisory committees. It could be participation in public-private partnerships,
Yeah.
International standard setting groups, IMDRF, ICH, those types of groups. I'm trying to follow that. I'm also trying to follow two other things. One being, what are they doing in the guidance and policy regulatory development area? How are they going to implement the 10-for-1 executive order? And what are they saying in speeches, articles, et cetera? So, for example, recently, Dr. McCary gave a talk at FDA. Also, RFK gave a talk. So listening to those and trying to pull out threads, those are kind of four things that I am watching.
Thanks, Ralph. Ron, any comments?
No, I thought that was a great summary by Ralph.
Yeah, thanks.
What surprised me about all of this, if I can shift gears for a second, is that there are some people on Capitol Hill and elsewhere who actually support what's going on at FDA. Ron, I've heard you talk a little bit about this, how surprised some people are on the Hill, including very knowledgeable people, to hear nice things about FDA. And just in Washington and elsewhere where people are tracking it, they say, well, the agency is a bit bloated and it needs to have different policies, and it needs to focus more on chronic diseases, just as RFK says, and it is in the pocket of industry. What I know there's no real answer to this, but Ron and Ralph, why do you think that we live in a world in which some people, some of whom are very knowledgeable, think that about FDA?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that. I'm puzzled and I am concerned with all those observations, Wayne. But I would say that the narrative, beginning all the way back in the campaign, was so negative towards the agency, towards the FDA and the NIH.
Mm-hmm.
And we heard candidates talking about corruption at the FDA and about the FDA being in the pockets of industry. And those narratives are still part and parcel of the political conversation on the Hill. And we really need a concerted effort to remind people that not only are the people at the FDA assigned a huge mission for the health of the American people, but that they are performing it exceedingly well with very limited resources. We need to emphasize the quality and the excellence there, as well as the exceptionalism of the agency and its mission. So I'll stop there for a second and let Ralph comment.
I was talking a number of years ago to a then center director, long since retired, and his comment was, every day I come to work, half the country is going to be mad at me. I just hope it's a different half of the country. Every decision but that FDA on like a product approval, which is where the focus is, you're going to make somebody upset. it's almost definitionally either you're always too fast or you're always too slow. If the product is safe and effective, why didn't you get it done 6 months earlier? If the product turns out to have problems, oh, you went too fast. And so FDA is always in that balancing act of trying to have enough data, enough evidence that something is safe and effective for the intended use without excessive delays. And so it's this balance point that is basically impossible ever to justify after the fact.
I will take the opportunity to add to all that as Wayne knows, before we got together for this, I was involved in an hour-long meeting of the Board of Directors of the Alliance for a Stronger FDA, on which Wayne and I both serve. And I was able to report to them some conversations recently I'd had on Capitol Hill, in which, as always, I'm singing the praises of our dear friends and colleagues at the agency and all they are doing for all of us. And after saying all that to several people on the Hill at various times, including at the confirmation hearing of Dr. McCary, the response from these people was, wow, that's the first positive thing I've ever heard about the agency. Just to illustrate how that negative narrative has sort of infused itself in the political dialogue right now. So we really have a big job ahead of us to try to alter that narrative to reality. I mean, these people are really devoted public servants trying to do their level best to help all of us, whether it's food or biologics or drugs or tobacco. Well, they are totally committed and devoted to the health of the American people. I would add to that speaking of chronic diseases, rare genetic diseases are chronic diseases, and they will not answer to better food and more exercise. So we need medical products.
Ralph, one final question. You've been teaching food and drug law for a long time and have been involved with the community. Put this all into some historical perspective. Step back up to as many feet as you want to go in the air and put it into some perspective.
I think this is what I will call a generational rethink of FDA. Mm-hmm. And I think we've had these only a couple times in the past. And this is the first one, in my opinion, that is not driven by a public health disaster. So if you think 1938, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, elixir of sulfanilamide, several hundred dead people, mostly children. 1962, the new drug amendments, thalidomide. 1976, the new drug or the device amendments, the Dalcon shield and the Shiley heart valve. Those are generational switches. And they were all triggered by a public health problem. This time, we're seeing, I think, a generational change, not because of a public health disaster, but because people are rethinking what is the role and the operation of government. So I think that is a major differentiating factor, but I do think this is a generational switch.
And are you optimistic? Again, final question for both of you. Are you optimistic that FDA will be able to continue to provide an acceptable level of consumer protection moving forward, given the changes that you're seeing? Ron, let me start with you, and then Ralph, and then we'll wrap.
I would answer that sort of in a 50-50 mode, Wayne. I think constantly about what Rob Califf said publicly recently, that the FDA as we knew it is gone. And my hope, bordering on optimism, is that the good news is we didn't just work with the senior leadership at the FDA. We worked with wonderful human beings up and down the staff at the FDA, and as many of them that remain will continue to be committed to our cause, and that we can make real progress in this new environment, in this new generational shift, as Ralph has called it, because we know those people continue to be devoted to the mission of the FDA and helping us in our mission to treat and cure patients.
I think about this in three buckets. One is the protection aspect. I'm cautiously optimistic that they will maintain the protection part of their job in their review of submissions, for example. So I'm cautiously optimistic there. The next one is innovation. I don't know there because of the cuts and whether they will have the expertise, the resources, et cetera, to learn and develop new technologies, proteomics, AI, nanotechnology, all are evolving rapidly, as well as business models are evolving. So I think on the innovation support aspect, I'm less certain. The last is communications. One of the key functions of FDA is to communicate. And I think that we have seen areas across the government where communication efforts have not been very successful. And with the cuts in communication staff, policymaking staff, I'm least optimistic on the communication front.
Let me just add, those are wonderful points Ralph just made. I'd like to add a little bit to the middle one on the innovation. I think genuine innovation and genuine flexibility require leadership. Without the leadership to give top cover to the reviewers and the subordinate staff, without that kind of leadership, the default position is always the most conservative, which is to say, no, we're not going to approve this. We continue to need the kind of senior leadership and mid-level leadership that gives that kind of top cover to the reviewers and their office directors to proceed on an innovative, flexible path to treatments and cures.
And I think innovation is more than just technology. It's innovation of new healthcare delivery systems. How do we deal with rural health? How do we deal with home health? How do we deal with an aging population? So it's obviously scientific, technical innovation, but it's also the healthcare system innovation that FDA needs to play a leadership role in advancing those improvements.
Thanks, Ralph.
On that note, let us conclude this podcast. I want to remind our listeners to subscribe, fdawatch.net. And this podcast, I think, provided some particular insights by two ultra knowledgeable people about FDA. Thank you both for being here today.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Shelly.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Ralph. Thanks, Ron. And thanks to our podcast creator and producer, Michael Levin-Epstein, and our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. And as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch.